Welcome, everyone. I see lots of folks joining in, so we'll give everyone a chance to join and then we will get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We're waiting for everyone to pile in here and then we'll get started in just a minute. Okay. I am going to start introductions and we won't get too far while people are still coming in here right now, because I know that you guys are all here to hear our panelists because they have a lot of awesome information to share. So I'm going to get us started here. So welcome everyone and thank you so much for joining us and happy Earth Day. My name is Jess Mazur. I'm the Conservation Program Coordinator for the Sierra Club Iowa chapter. I am a lifelong Iowan and I have been working for nearly a decade on water quality, factory farm issues, and other agricultural issues. And in honor of Earth Day and to relaunch our soil policy, we decided to have a really exciting panel discussion. And that's what you're here tonight to see. Digging into soil health, a new vision for agriculture. It's very clear that we need to transform our agricultural system. Our water is polluted, our soil is eroding, farmers are stuck selling below the cost of production far too often, and all of this while big agribusiness corporations are making record profits. And we know this isn't how it should be, but we're living in a world that tells us that this is the only way to farm. We hear get big or get out, fence row to fence row farming. Changing agriculture will destroy our economy. And sometimes that narrative gets in the way of making the changes that we need. And that's why we're here tonight. We're going to challenge that narrative with real world examples of farmers who are trying new things, who hold different value systems, and who are leading the way to transform our agricultural system. This summer, Sierra Club Iowa chapter members will be digging into soil health. We have a vision for agriculture that we've laid out in our soil policy, and Pam has that in the chat box, but try to read it later and pay attention tonight and just save that for your nightly reading. But we'll be highlighting this policy in many ways over the summer. So thank you so much for joining this kickoff event on Earth Day. Tonight, we are very lucky to have three incredible people joining us who are leading the way on a new agricultural system that will regenerate our environment. It'll provide dignity to farmers and revives our rural communities. And I don't want to waste any time, so I'm just going to cover a few housekeeping items and then we'll get started. So first off, this webinar will be recorded and we'll upload it to our YouTube channel in the next couple of days. And we will have a Q&A period at the end. So please put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you put them in the chat, sometimes those are hard to find as we get far into the discussion. So try to put those in the Q&A box. It makes it easier for us to make sure we don't miss your question. And then lastly, I'm really curious to see where you all are from. So please open up the chat box and just type in your name and where you're from so we can see where everyone is from. So let's get started. I'm going to introduce each panelist and then give them a few minutes to introduce themselves, to tell us about their farming operations and agricultural experience, and some of the values that they hold around protecting our soil and our environment. I'm going to start off with Denise O'Brien. Denise O'Brien is a farmer and community volunteer from Atlantic, Iowa. She has farmed with her husband, Larry Harris, for 45 years. She's a wife, mother, and grandmother. Denise and Larry maintain 17 acres of the original Harris farm, 5 of which are certified organic fruit and vegetable production, incorporating a high tunnel and greenhouse for starter plants. Denise also raises turkeys and chickens for meat and egg production, and she loves the physical and mental challenge that organic vegetable production offers her aging body. Throughout her career, Denise has been involved in her community as well as the agricultural sector. She's the co-founder of the Women Food and Agricultural Network. She is the past chair of the board of directors of the Pesticide Action Network of North America. Denise helped found and served on the board for Sustainable Iowa Land Trust, and she currently serves on the board of the Iowa Organic Association and is the chair of the County Democratic Party and is an assistant soil and water commissioner. So Denise, wow, that is quite the resume. You are very involved. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Oh, Jess, thank you. And thanks for everybody. I've gone through some of the names, and hi to everybody out there. thanks for coming today. There are a lot of choices of things to do for Earth Day, and for you to come to visit with us is really an honor. And it really makes me know how much people care about Iowa, how much you all care about Iowa. And yeah, I just pretty much mentioned it all. The one thing that we are doing here that I haven't put much in my resume or my bio or whatever, Larry and I are building a straw bale house. And so, and we've put solar in on the farm. This is a dream come true. We dreamed about having straw bales. So we got our straw bales from the Madsen farm, 20 miles from here. So we have organically certified straw, and we're using the clay outside that's outside the house to make to plaster. So we are in the plastering mode for the next few months, and it's going to be very energy efficient and very local materials. So it's a dream come true for us. And so, and yeah, I mean, 45 years gives me a good perspective of what things have happened over the years. And when we started out farming, and Francis can testify to that, it was really hard to say that you were organic. It was like you couldn't say the organic word. You can't say the O word out loud. And so now it's come a long way. We have the Iowa Organic Association, but we still have a long way to go. And one of my dreams is that we tear apart the agribusiness hold on Iowa and take it back. I've just been thinking about how we brand this. How do we brand this, issue of, like when domestic violence, they had take back the night, so women could go out at the night. So at night and be safe. And so how do we take back Iowa so we have what we all want, but don't have because other people are making decisions about it? So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Denise. Next up is Francis Thicke. Francis Thicke, with his wife Susan, is the owner and operator of an organic dairy and crop farm near Fairfield, Iowa. They process their milk on the farm and market their dairy products to local grocery stores and restaurants. They're also experimenting with regenerative grazing and cropping practices on their farm. Francis has a PhD in soil fertility and has in the past served as the national program leader for the soil science for the USDA Extension Service. So thanks for joining us, Francis.
Thank you, Jess. Just my own background, I grew up in Minnesota on a dairy farm, and I first went to college and studied music and philosophy, and then I came back and farmed for 9 years. And during that time, in about 75, we converted to organic. And Denise is right, you didn't want to tell your neighbors that you were organic because it was considered heresy. And then in the 80s, I went to graduate school, and I learned pretty quickly, for sure, you don't want to tell your professors that you studied, that you were an organic farmer. But it's interesting to see how over the years that has evolved. Even when I was at USDA, it was not good to talk about sustainable agriculture in the late 80s and early 90s. And then funding came from USDA for sustainable agriculture. Suddenly, everybody wanted to get on the bandwagon. And in about 2003, funding came for organic agriculture. And then the scientists want to get on that bandwagon. So now organic is fine to talk about, and everybody wants money to do research in organic farming.
Great. And you're a great example of doing that. So I'm excited to hear more about that later on in the discussion. Our other panelist is Dr. John Eiger, Professor Emeritus of Agricultural Economics, retired from the University of Missouri in 2000. He was raised on a small dairy farm, worked in private industry, and held several other academic positions prior to returning to the University of Missouri. In the 80s, John had a conversion of sorts after seeing the failures of the policies he'd been advocating to farmers. He then reoriented his work toward agricultural and economic sustainability, a means of supporting small family farms in rural communities. Since retiring, John has maintained an active speaking schedule and has authored numerous books and papers, many of which can be found at his university website. And I will put a link to that in the chat. John is recognized as a longtime leading voice in the sustainable agricultural movement. So thank you for joining us, Dr. Ikerd.
Thank you. It's an honor to be on the panel with people that are actually doing the things that some of us talk and write about. I always appreciate those opportunities. Well, as you said, to give a little perspective on my background, the last 35 years or so, I've been focusing my work on what I call sustainable agriculture, sustainability, economic sustainability, agriculture sustainability. Some people have kind of abandoned the word sustainability. They say, well, nobody knows what it means anymore. It's been so co-opted, abused, and misused that it's meaningless. But those of us that kind of have dealt with this and take it seriously, I think there's general agreement about what it means. It means that it's the ability to meet the needs of the present without diminishing opportunities for the future. And in terms of a sustainable agriculture, that means an agriculture that can meet the basic food needs of everyone in the present and can do that in such a way that those people of future generations will have equal opportunities to do the same. And there's a whole range of agriculture approaches that fit under that umbrella of sustainability, including organic and biodynamic and ecological and biological and resilient and holistic management. And more recently, regenerative is the one that kind of gets all the public attention. But what these approaches have in common, they realize that you have to balance the ecological with the economic and the social dimensions of farming or agriculture in order to sustain it over the long run. I guess you could say I really spent the first half of my academic career when I was promoting industrial agriculture, thinking I was really moving toward a sustainable agriculture because we did that. Those of us that were supporting it, we did it because we thought it was going to provide good food for everyone. It was going to provide for security for the present. We weren't thinking too much about the future, but we certainly were thinking about providing food security for the present. And we were going to do that by improving the efficiency of agriculture. We'd reduce the cost of production of farming, and we'd bring down food costs, but we'd create profitable opportunities for family farmers, and that would be viable rural communities would be a consequence of that. And then we would bring down the cost of food, so it would be a win for the farmers, a win for the community, and a win for the consumers. You know, it was well intended, but the problem was it simply didn't work. It didn't work for the farmers that were forced out of the business. As the farms become larger, they inevitably become fewer. And it didn't work for the rural communities that depended upon those families. And it didn't work for the land that was soil that was being eroded and environment that was being polluted by agricultural chemicals and biological waste. You know, looking back at it, I think it was easier for me to understand that than it was a lot of my colleagues because of how I grew up. I grew up, as you said, on a small family farm in Southwest Missouri. It was a farm that my dad, with a fourth grade education, had bought during the Great Depression, and we were trying to pay for it. And these were hard times. And we lived with nature. We lived from the soil. We knew if the soil wasn't productive, we wouldn't have crops. We wouldn't have anything to eat because we didn't use fertilizers and we didn't use pesticides. We depended upon nature. And we depended upon the crops and the livestock. And if we didn't have enough hogs to sell in the fall and have something left to eat, we depended upon nature to get us through the winter. It was easier for me to see that there's something fundamentally wrong in the flaws of agriculture because we had lost our sense of connectedness between trying to pursue economic efficiency and the consequences for family farms and rural communities and the consequence of the land. That's all interconnected. We could see that when I was growing up, but we lost that sense of interconnectedness and we had unintended consequences, well-intended, but unintended negative social, ecological, even economic consequences for rural communities. And I'm becoming more and more convinced that if we're to address sustainability and a sustainability agriculture and our food system, we have to regain that sense of connectedness among each other and with nature. And then we can farm and live and work sustainably when we live and work in harmony with nature.
Wow, thank you. Thank you. So this question is for Denise and Francis. I'll give you each a chance to answer it. In recent years, we've heard a lot about regenerative agriculture or carbon farming or whatever the hot word is to talk about a new farming system. What do those terms and ideas mean to you? And Denise, why don't you go first?
Okay, what those words mean to me are they can be easily co-opted, and we're out there. They're good words, and you know, John talked about sustainability in that. But over my period of farming years, and that we can see how many times the organic standards have been co-opted. We've seen how, you know, people talking about, you know, carbon credits. It's from the discussions that I see and the things that I read and the people that I talk to, there's a real danger in carbon credits becoming a way to sustain the agribusiness, the big farms, and that, you know, who's going to get the payments? How are they done? You know, how will organic farmers who've been doing carbon, you know, capturing for a long time, how do they get compensated for maybe their past work and our past work? So I just, names and titles sort of make me skeptical, and they make, you know, they kind of send up red flags to me that who's saying that, you know, and who is saying, you know, is Monsanto saying, you know, regenerative, you know, and they're stealing those words. You can see that happen. And you know, greenwashing, I think, is the term that people use for it. And so I think that they're good words, but we have to define as farmers and citizens what those definitions are, and keep those sacred is a word I come up with, but to keep them very strong, and call out the people who are using them, the corporations that are using them, and confront that. So it's a two-way street, kind of.
Thank you. And Frances, going off of what she said as well, so what is it that we're talking about when we say those words?
Yeah, I think Denise is right. It's real easy for these words to get co-opted, and for agribusiness to try to redefine it so they can have business as usual and call it, you know, carbon sequestration or whatever. I'm going to put a slide up here though, if I can. Here, hang on. And I'm going to stop my video because, yeah, here, because I don't have good bandwidth here. And I think that Denise is right that we have to define these terms. And if you look at the principle of soil health, which is converging agreement on what this means by the people who are working in this area. And you can see that's very different from what we see in conventional agriculture. But I have the principles of soil health really being the same principles as the principles of regenerative agriculture, which is also the same things that sequester carbon. And let's look at these points. The first one is to have soil cover at all times, to armor the soil so it doesn't erode from the rain and so on. Now, as we go through these points, think about what you see around Iowa when you're driving around now. None of these points really pertain to our conventional agriculture for the most part, I guess. The second one, minimize physical and chemical disturbance of the soil. And this is one that minimizing the physical disturbance that organic farmers struggle with. But we're having new technology and new ways of doing it now. And physical disturbance helps breaks down the carbon in the soil, as does chemical disturbance of the soil, the pesticides, the herbicides, and so on. The third point, I think, is really key. Living roots in the soil at all times. That is so important. And we don't see that now. Very few fields we see now have cover crops growing during the winter time. And cover crops mean you have living roots in the soil all the time. Or perennials, like a pasture system that's well managed that has deep roots in the soil. And there's a lot of reasons for this. One, it holds the soil in place, but also we're learning more and more that plants that are alive, they're putting carbon into the soil even while they're growing. You know, they're photosynthesizing, collecting energy, and they're making fixing carbon from the atmosphere, carbon dioxide, to grow their physical bodies. But also, interestingly, they're exuding. They're spitting a lot of that carbon out as liquid carbon into the soil to feed the bacteria that are around the rhizosphere, around the soil root, the plant roots. And so the plant is intentionally feeding the bacteria in the soil, and then the bacteria help to feed the plants by cycling the nutrients. So this is very important to have living roots in the soil at all times which we rarely see here in Iowa in our corn soybean system. The next principle, plant diversity. The more diversity, the better, because different plants have different root patterns, have different bacteria that colonize the roots. It just adds a lot to the whole carbon cycle to have a diversity. And the last point is if we can integrate animals, because the way we built our soils here in Iowa, our rich soils, was really, we didn't do it. We've actually degenerated it. But the livestock on the prairie, the bison, the antelope, the elk, and so on, they interacted with those prairie grasses to help the plants to put more carbon in the soil. When the bison would come in, for example, and knock down the prairie, eat and knock down the prairie grasses, then it would be a mulch on top, and the plant would slough some roots off into the ground and then grow new tops and new roots. And so if we can integrate animals onto the landscape as much as possible, that is very helpful for regenerating our soils. Of course, if we look around Iowa, we see the opposite. We see animals in CAFOs, we see monoculture crops. Wendell Berry said it very well. He said, we had before an integrated system of animals on a landscape. We took them apart and we created two pollution problems, a pollution problem of industrial crop production and a pollution problem of industrial livestock production. So I'll quit right there. Sorry, I had to get into that a little deeper.
No, that was great. I think that's great, because I think that's what we hear a lot, is we hear people saying, well, what does it really mean? What are we talking about when we say sustainable? And I think it is confusing because of what Denise was saying, is that the others, industrial agriculture is trying to say the same thing, trying to confuse us on what that really means. So I appreciate that slide. Next question is for Dr. Ikerd. So you've had a very interesting change in your belief system about agriculture economies. Can you tell us a little bit more about how and why you've switched gears?
Well, as I sometimes call it, my come to Jesus moment was in the 1980s when I began to realize that what I'd been spending, 15 years on and 4 years in graduate school prior to that wasn't working. And so it's really hard to face after you build a whole career, not only an academic career, but also working in industry and things like that in one area. And you decide that it's not working anymore. But it was during the farm financial crisis of the 1980s. I worked as a livestock marketing specialist in North Carolina and Oklahoma. But at that time, I'd moved to the University of Georgia as head of the Extension Agricultural Economics Department. And that was a period of time during the 1970s. It's what farmers refer to a lot of times the cost price squeeze. Farm prices were going up, but input prices were going up faster. And so farmers were caught in a price squeeze. Price of land was going up. So a lot of us so-called expert economists said, farmers, well, you just need to borrow money against your land and you can expand the operation. You'll be able to produce more and reduce your costs, and everything's going to work out because the export markets are growing. They're going to continue to grow. But it didn't work out that way. We got into the 1980s. We were facing a high inflation problem, high interest rates. And the farmers were borrowing a lot of money at those high interest rates, but bring inflation under control. Then basically we tightened up on the money supply. We put the country into a recession that turned into a global recession. The export markets dried up, commodity prices come crashing down. And we had a lot of farmers out here that were caught with huge debts at high interest rates, and they couldn't even cover the interest payments, let alone the principal. And you would go on the network news at night and there would be regular features on farm foreclosures and bankruptcies, and farm suicides were not uncommon, particularly in Georgia where I was at that time. And it was the responsibility of people in my department. We would go out and try to help these farmers. We'd go over their books with them, trying to help find some way to survive or get them to sell out while they still had equity, or at least talk them out of committing suicide. And in talking with these farmers that were having the problems in here, I've come to realize the farmers with the biggest problems were the ones that have been doing what we so-called experts have been telling them to do. That was the get big or get out time. You've got to be at economies of scale in order to survive. So they had followed along with what we had recommended, and now they were caught in huge debt. I knew there was something fundamentally wrong. When I sat across the table from these people, as I could see what was happening out here in rural communities. This kind of agriculture wasn't working for farmers, as I said before, because they were going broke. And then I could look around to the rural communities. We were losing population, rural population, just like a landslide going down at that time. There were counties that lose 20, 30% of their population within 10-year period of time. It's destroying the rural communities. And actually, I only become aware of the environmental problems after the others, is when we begin to see the social and economic problems, that what we're doing to the soil with soil erosion, farming fence row to fence row, again, which people were telling farmers to do. And what we were doing was polluting the air and water with agricultural, chemical, and biological waste. And, you know, if you look at it objectively, that's not a successful agriculture. That's not a sustainable agriculture. There was nothing about it that was sustainable. Now, thankfully, you know, this was about the time, as Francis talked about, the sustainable agriculture movement was coming along. And I eventually decided I couldn't continue to teach what I'd been taught, that there's no way I could do that. And once I started criticizing the system, I could see that my administrative career within the university system was quickly coming to a halt. So I needed to look for something else to do. And I was able to get some of that first money you talked about, Francis, from USDA to go to put together a project where I could go back to the University of Missouri. So, you know, as looking back now, as I mentioned before, all of this was well intended. We just simply did not anticipate the negative consequences that have come about. Maybe we should have, but we didn't. We just assumed that these farmers that would be displaced would find better jobs somewhere else, that the farming was kind of drudgery anyway, so they'd go somewhere else. And we just assumed that if you had more economic output, if the farm economy was strong, then it'd be good for rural communities, but it wasn't. Rural communities depend upon people. These were unintended consequences. And so that kind of come to Jesus moment changed my whole professional career, and it's changed my life since. And that's the reason I've been retired 20 years and still continue to do it. I guess I'm trying to make up for the early years when I was promoting the alternative.
Jesse, can I jump in here a second?
Absolutely.
You know, the time John was talking about, I was at USDA in Washington from 88 to 92, working on extension issues. And there were a few radical guys out there around the country that were talking about sustainable agriculture, and they were considered off the reservation. And one of them was John Eiger. He was a leader back in those days. He kind of, you know, created a path for a lot of other people to follow more safely in the future. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Okay, this one's for you, Francis. So you have a PhD in agronomy, so you probably know more about soil than really anyone here. So for folks that are not in farming, can you share just like at a 101 level, why is soil so important? And if we take care of it, what benefits will we see? Oh, you're on mute, Francis.
Well, I mentioned how our soils evolved over 12,000 years or more in Iowa. We got these productive soils through nature's ecology creating them. Well, we also need to look at, since we started farming in Iowa, we've lost about half of our soil to erosion. We've lost about 60% of our organic carbon in the soil to our farming practices. So we've been deficit spending our ecological capital all these years. And you can only do that so long. Fortunately, in Iowa, we have a lot of ecological capital in most places. Now in Southern Iowa, it's not so much. It's more hilly. The farm that we have that we bought 25 years ago, it was very eroded, very hilly. In some places, all the topsoil is gone. So we're starting over again in those areas, rebuilding soil. So and it's a long process. So conventional agriculture, the way we've been doing it, erosion is a huge problem, but also the chemicals put on the soil tend to narrow the ecology of the soil. So you have a very narrow ecology. You don't have that robust soil microbiology needed for regenerating the soils. And even some of them are pretty harsh. Commonly now we're seeing applicators putting anhydrous ammonia on the soil, which is ammonia that's injected into the soil. When you look at it though, that band about 8 inches where the ammonia is injected basically kills all the bacteria, all the microbiology in that band. Now, because you put all that fertility there, come back in a couple of weeks and it'll be very teeming. It'll be a lot of happening there, but it'll be a very narrow kind of ecology happening. But also that anhydrous ammonia is high in pH. And so it'll dissolve some of the organic matter. So look next time it rains hard after anhydrous ammonia is put on, look at the runoff into the ponds or into the creeks. And if you see a yellow tint, that's dissolved organic matter from putting anhydrous ammonia on the soil. So we could go on and on about the way we farm now, but the key thing is that we need to start looking at ways we can go back to those 5 principles I mentioned. Have living roots in the soil all times, disturb the soil as little as possible, chemically and physically, and having the diversity and having animals on the landscape as much as possible.
Thank you very much. And I think we have a question later on. So if we're not going to use chemicals, how do we do that? So keep that in mind. We're going to ask that here in a little bit. Denise, so one of the things that shocks people when they learn about farming here in Iowa is that even, we're the most productive agricultural place in the country, maybe even the world, but we don't really grow much food for humans here. Why is it important to you to grow food? And, do you face any struggles because you're not just growing corn and soybeans or hogs?
Oh, wow. That's been the biggest disappointment to me as I've worked on local food systems over the years, and that we import so much food and to eat, that we have this luscious land and that we're quickly destroying, and then we're not feeding the people around us. And in the 90s, I worked a lot on food insecurity and food deserts. People are now saying food apartheid because it's been a planned thing, and they're using that term. And it's really and I want to address that, we're the most productive in the world, but at a cost. The cost has been the ecological cost. When I talk to people and say, yeah, we're the highest producers of hogs and corn and beans and that, but we have, undrinkable water. We're in the middle of the hot zone that sends all this downstream into the, and destroys other people's lives at the same time. It's very difficult for me to understand why people don't connect the dots on that. Iowa, before 1941, when there was a big freeze, produced apples and grapes and all sorts of fruits. Rich Pirog, when he was at the Leopold Center, had a lot of research done on this, and he did a lot of research on it. And so to me, it's a place where people can get into farming. It used to be when Larry and I started farming, we started with hogs, and hogs were the mortgage burner. You could have a couple of litters a year, and you could sell the hogs and sell the pigs and make it through until you sell your beef or until you sell your crops or whatever. There was that system, and that's not available anymore with the CAFOs and that. So it's a way that if we are very serious about getting younger people into farming to replace the aging farm population, then I think growing food for local consumption, regional consumption. And one thing the legislature has done this year, although it was threatened this week, was looking at because of COVID and because of the vertically integrated and consolidated meat processing industry, looking at ways to help start up small lockers and processing and teaching butchery. And that's the direction that we have to go. And if we're going to learn lessons from what has happened this past year with COVID, the really important part is to understand that large systems don't work.
Absolutely. Dr. Ikerd, so tell us what a vibrant local foods economy could look like in Iowa if we're talking about food for humans, and how does that contrast with our current food economy?
Well, I can give you my perspective, my vision. Whether that fits other people's, I don't know. But I foresee in the future, I don't know how long it take to get there, that what we'll do is replace this current industrial food system with a network of bioregional networks of local community, sustainable food systems that we'll replace them with them. And we'll do it according to the principles now of agroecology, which is kind of the science of sustainability. It's a coming together of agriculture with the science of ecology. And the first principle of ecology is all interconnected. And if we begin to see the farm, the farmer, the community, the soil, the plants, the animals as all part of an interconnected whole, then we begin to realize that if farm and have sustainable production that meets the needs of everyone within society, we have to do that locally within communities, and it has to be fit to a particular ecological place. You have to have a farm that fits the ecology of that farm and the psychology of the farmer and the sociology and culture of the community, and all of those things have to function in harmony. And I think we're moving toward that, and I think we do that, and there's a solid basis for it. There's a whole global movement called food sovereignty, that basically those are the principles that underlie it. It says everybody has a basic human right to good food that's produced in a sustainable way, and people have a right to determine their own local food system. So I see that's where we're going, and it's all on to be interconnected. We'll recognize that that taking care of the soil and taking care of the people and providing food security, it's all part of the same ecological, social, economic whole. And we got to make those kind of systems economically viable. And I think that we can. I think the biggest obstacle is this current mechanistic worldview that evolved out of the scientific revolution, but it says that the world is a big mechanism and you can specialize, standardize, manipulate it, make it do whatever you want to. If you've got a problem with it, you can take it apart and look at the parts and repair the parts, replace the parts or whatever, and that doesn't work because agriculture is biological. We're biological. We depend upon the biology of agriculture. It's a living system. Nature and humanity work like living systems, and the current agricultural system's in direct conflict with that, and there's no way to fix it except to replace it with an ecological, biological, organismic kind of system that functions in harmony with nature and within society and within communities as a whole. And you come up with systems that are organic, that are interconnected, they're diverse systems like Francis was talking about before. It's like that. And I think that's the farms and the food systems of the future will function in harmony with nature. And there's ways of doing that. I'm working with a community out in Denver called Metro Caring, and we're looking at the concept of using community food utilities, use a public utility in order to insulate the local community food system from the larger economy as a whole, so that you can begin to do things internally that you can't do in even a perfectly working market economy. And so I think there's ways of achieving it, and that's my vision of the future. And I don't know whether we'll get there or not, but I know that it's possible. And when there's possibility, there's hope.
I completely agree. Just on Monday, I was actually out visiting a farm up in Northwest Iowa, and there was the landowner and the farmer were out there, and the farmer, he was saying that, a few years ago, maybe 1 in 100 farmers in his area would have considered trying cover crops, or I was out at the farm, they were installing some grass waterways and prairie strips. And he said, but now there's like 1 in 20 that are asking questions or interested in his area. And I said, well, why is that? Why do you think it's changing? And he said, well, we've had a lot of drought seasons in the past few years and a lot of really wet seasons. And he goes, those of us that did no-till, we did really well during the wet seasons. And those of us that had cover crops did really well in the dry season. Or was vice versa maybe. But it was just that with a changing climate, I think people are starting to see that farmers that are trying new things, whether they've fully transitioned or even just implementing some small things, are being impacted. And that really opens the door for us to talk about this, because we know that sustainable agriculture, it can withstand climate change much better than industrial agriculture. Sorry, I got us off topic a little bit there. But Francis, this kind of goes back to the question we were talking about earlier on how we apply so many chemicals to the ground and it kind of kills whatever in the soil. So how do we do it if we're not going to use chemicals, if we're not going to have pesticides and anhydrous ammonia? What is the alternative?
That's a good question. And it depends upon the system. For example, livestock production. At our farm, we have 60 small pastures. So the cows get milked twice a day, After each milking, they go out to a new pasture, and they come back for milking and go out to a new pasture. So in this system, the cows are harvesting their own feed. The landscape has perennial crops on it, grasses and clovers. And so it's protected, and we don't need to use the chemicals under that kind of system. Compare that to most dairy farms. The cows are confined near the milking facility, and the corn and soybeans and so on are harvested at a distance and brought to the cows. And so that's a whole different system. It takes a lot more chemicals. Now, what about cropping? I'm going to try to go to a slide, which I think is kind of fun here. So hang on a second. I'm going to stop my video. I'm going to go to, oops, I got to go to share screen here. Okay. So what we've been doing, most, in Iowa, we only have about 3% of our corn and soybeans in cover crops. Usually it's a perennial rye cover crop. And generally it grows about 8 to 10 inches or 12 inches tall. And then the farmer will come in and kill it with Roundup and then plant the next crop. But what organic farmers are doing, and this is from my farm, is we let that rye crop grow up to almost maturity just before it makes a seed head. And it's about 6 feet tall then, and it has about 8 to 10,000 pounds of biomass. And here I'm planting soybeans right into that rye crop. And the planter is knocking it down pretty well already. But let's see. We also have what's called a roller crimper that comes by, and it not only flattens the rye out more, but it actually kinks it every few inches so that it won't come back up. So now you have a mulch layer all summer, and the soybeans will grow right up through that mulch layer. But it protects the weeds from coming through. And so as the crop grows up, if you got enough biomass, you can get by without using any chemicals. Of course, in organic, we don't use them anyway, those kind of herbicides and so on. And so you can end up with a nice weed-free field. And we've met a lot of the principles of regenerative agriculture, soil health we talked about. One is we got the soil covered with that soil armor. We've got living roots in the soil all the time. We don't have a lot of diversity, but we're working on trying to get more diversity. We don't have the animals on these fields, but sometimes we do actually have the animals graze the cover crops. So these are some exciting things that we're trying to do in organic farming and regenerative farming that I think that will help a lot to help us sequester carbon and protect our soils.
Yeah, and think about, I guess you're probably saving a ton of money on the inputs of having to get anhydrous ammonia and any pesticide or herbicide or anything.
It can save a lot on inputs, yes.
Yeah, awesome.
Especially think of the grazing system where the cows are harvesting. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say the grazing system where the cows are harvesting their own feed. Can you still hear me? Okay. Then you don't need to haul the feed to the cows, and you don't need to use all the herbicides and chemicals on the cropland. And so you're saving a lot of inputs because the cows are doing all the work. They're harvesting it and they're enjoying their work, of course. And while they're doing it, they're improving the whole system. We're improving the soil. We're improving the livestock, the diversity in the landscape. The cows are healthier because they're in their natural environment, eating their natural diet. And the milk and meat from cows on grass is higher in healthy nutrients like omega-3 fatty acids, conjugated linoleic acids, and such. So we're improving the whole system from the soil through the landscape, through the animals, and for the people eating the products, just by following nature's ecology.
Yeah, and that probably protects the water as well. That'd be a great way if we implemented that statewide, that we could, have less runoff that's full of chemicals and nitrate.
Right.
And more. Thank you. Denise, this one is for you. So you have helped start and run quite a few agriculture focused organizations, and you've had the opportunity to network with all different kinds of farmers across the state. What are you hearing from farmers? And then also, what are some of the highlights? Like, I don't think we always hear about some of the amazing things that are happening. What are some of the highlights that we should know about that are happening across the state?
Those are good questions, Jess, and I appreciate that. Yeah, and there's so many things that Francis just said that I want to elaborate on. So I've got to remain focused here, but
Well, you can elaborate, and then I'll go back to this question if you have thoughts to follow up with Francis.
well, I think when we see examples of what Francis is doing, and I just drove down my road, and actually there's a couple farms that do have cover crops on my road, but they just applied glyphosate, and it's just like, I keep asking this question to those people who think they're doing just wonderful things about having cover crops, but then they're killing it with a weed killer. And it's like, what? You're still killing the bacteria, the biota, the really good stuff in the soil. And so there's a lot of work to do. And so people, when Francis shows what he's doing, he's like, well, Francis can do that, but I can't do that. Just like people have told us over the years, well, that's okay for Denise and Larry to do, but we can't do it that way. And the thing is that the government policy really makes it hard for people to do. The farmers I look at are victims of a system that's created for, capital gain for corporations. And we've seen that in the concentration of seed and feed and animals. And so they are in a system that doesn't always work for them, but it's comfortable because they know how it works. When you venture out to do things like Francis does or like we do, then it gets a little dicey, and you're feeling a little uncomfortable, and that it's one of those things that and the age of the farmer. I learned this when I was running for Secretary of Agriculture years ago, and I think probably Francis did too, is that you can't, they're really tied into a system they can't get out of, and you can't confront them about it, and you can't you can't change things unless you change policy, and you have leaders that will change that policy. So some of the good things that are happening is that there are possibilities for farmers, and and there's organizations that are helping beginning farmers access land. Land is getting really expensive now, and I helped starting an organization called Sustainable Iowa Land Trust, and it's a place where people can donate their land, and that's happening. There's several farms that SILT has, and then SILT can put a farmer on the land, a farm family on the land, and they can gain equity, they can farm, they can do everything without the capital cost of the land. And so it makes it a bit easier. And I think that's a good thing. The things that PFI is doing, the Practical Farmers of Iowa, that they're teaching farmers to do things, but they're still on that we're still operating within a system that's really working against us. And farming, look, I mean, now we see all these, all the trees and things are being torn out. Corn is $6 a bushel, and beans are 15. So everybody is going to take advantage of that, and the price is going to drop. I never could understand why people would do that way, increase their acreage to really absolutely help make the prices drop. It doesn't make sense. And so our land gets ruined in the meantime. And so there, people feel captive within, that system that's being set up. And then, it's, large corporations have a hold on Washington, and people have the revolving door. They go from company to government to company, and they all make a little thing work for them. And we're the people that are out here driving the tractors and working for them and not making anything, not being able to put food on our table.
Thank you for sharing that. And I do love watching what SILT and PFI and other, like Iowa Farmers Union, what they're doing, because I think we don't hear enough of the examples of the good things that are happening across the state. They like to make us think that there's only one way. But Dr. Ikerd, I think this is a good question for you to kind of follow up on what Denise was saying is, so tell us about the system that keeps farmers stuck in it, like with the subsidies, and with just explain, what do we mean when we say that it is hard to try something new because we're stuck in this industrial model.
Right. I think if we're going to get the kind of change that we're talking about here that we really need, move away from this system, we've got to have a fundamental change in foreign policy. We've got to have a farm policy that will allow farmers to transition from this industrial farming system they're in now to a regenerative, sustainable farming system and not go broke in the process of it. But we do need to make the transition, and we need to, to start that process. We should have started it a long time ago, but we need to start that process. I think, first of all, we need to start with an understanding that the only thing that keeps this industrial system of agriculture going today is the support of the government programs. This industrial system of production is tremendously efficient in terms of extracting agricultural productivity from the land and from rural people, but it's inherently fragile and lacking in resilience. Denise talked about it a while ago with the COVID crisis, revealed how fragile that system is. If the government hadn't stepped in with subsidies and mandated a few things, the food system could easily have collapsed in 2020. It gets its resilience from the government programs. We, the taxpayers, basically share the risk that's inherent in big farming, just like we do with big banking. Our farms and our food industries, corporations are too big to fail, so we step in and do that. We need to recognize that. And what we need to do is have a transition over time where we share the risk of the transition for those that want to transition from industrial to sustainable, but also share the risk of new farmers that want to get started in it. And when I'm talking about changing, transitioning out, we're supporting it with subsidized crop insurance, and we're supporting it with various kinds of farm deficiency payments and things of that nature, subsidized credit, interest rate reduction, special treatment on taxes, but also virtually a lack of regulations of industrial agriculture that would be appropriate for any other industry. So we need to begin to transition out of this. We just removed the subsidies we put in industrial agriculture would go a long way. But we can make the change, and we need to recognize also that industrial agriculture was not an inevitable consequence of free markets or things of that nature. It was an intentional strategy. The technologies, particularly that come out of World War II, the chemical mechanical technologies, chemical mechanical basically made the transition possible. But what made it inevitable is when we had a shift in farm policies from supporting independent family farms to supporting industrial agriculture, as I talked about a while ago. Bring down the cost of food, make good food affordable to everybody. And that's what brought it about. And so we're going to have a transition. We've got to think about doing the same thing for these new and beginning farmers and transitioning farmers to get into sustainable and regenerative agriculture. I've worked with a group of young people on a proposal of Data for Progress folks that put together a proposal of regenerative agriculture and the Green New Deal. And one of the key things in this was transitioning away from commodity-based programs, including crop insurance and various other things, but transitioning to a whole farm net revenue insurance program that would basically ensure the family incomes of farmers that choose to transition to sustainable agriculture or regenerative agriculture and get started in that. That would be returning to the initial concept of what we had in the 30s with the farm programs. Parity prices were set in such a way to cover cost of living for farm families and give farm families a parity income with non-farm families. What we're talking about here is doing that directly and limiting the payments to what it would take to support a farm family during the transition. We need to support people that want to change the way they farm and start looking at providing the economic means of doing that, as opposed to looking to the government to provide an economic incentive for farmers to continue to find ways to continue the current system, but simply draw money from the government for farming practices that are within the old system and don't really address the problem.
Can I jump in 1 second here, Jess?
Of course.
I think that's great what John said, and I just like to point out that in the last couple of years we've spent tens of billions of dollars on farm subsidies, but we've not had any requirement for that. If we're going to have these subsidies, we should have at least a requirement to do something like a cover crop, pay a little extra for farmers to tie the subsidy to something that will improve the landscape. Now there's nothing. I'm reminded I'm driving to Iowa City. There's a sign in a farm field that says, just let us farm. Somebody puts that sign up there, just let us farm, meaning get the government off our back. They just want to farm. They want the subsidies. but they just want to let the farm the way they want to farm. And so we need to tie these subsidies to something that will improve the landscape. And even if we have to add a little extra subsidy to make it happen, to make it work, anything else is ridiculous, I think.
Yeah. And it's not even just on the federal level too. Like there are even bills up at the Capitol right now that kind of add into how we continue to subsidize industrial agriculture, like the beginning farmer tax credit bill, which we fully support the beginning farmer tax credit, but they're changing it this session to include the word or agricultural buildings, which then allows that to be used for confinement operations for factory farms. And, you know, there's this new technology they're saying, you know, they're kind of recognizing there's too much manure being produced in Iowa from all their factory farms. And, you know, they have the solution, and it's methane digesters to just turn the manure into energy. And it's a false solution. It's really expensive, and they know it's really expensive. So they're asking us to pay for it. And so there's a bill, again, the economic development bill has a whole new revolving loan fund so that we can pay for them to treat the manure. So it's happening at all levels too. And yeah, John, it looks like you wanted to say something there.
The only thing, you know, you can get support for these days or approval from, you know, the Farm Bureau or the agricultural industries or any of the corporations. The only thing you can get through in terms of policies is things that allow them to keep the same system in place and get paid for changing certain practices to appease the public concern, but not change the system. And
right.
we've got to have programs that focus on changing the system.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, and a lot of these things are like big engineering kinds of things. Like the digesters are a huge Band-Aid on a problem. We don't fix the problem, we put the Band-Aid on. And some of these things like the bioreactors at the base of a field, if we lose all this nutrients off the field, then we'll put a bioreactor, which is a huge construction project, to collect it. And I call these kind of things conservation diapers, because the field did not get managed right. It was incontinent. Now we have to collect it at the end and do it. So what we need to do is have an ecologically sound system on the farm field, and then we don't have to put the diapers on the bottom of the field.
That's a really good comparison, Francis. I have one more question for all three of you to answer, and then we're going to get to Q&A from some of the people that are on tonight. So all three of you get a chance to answer this. So, you know, more and more people are starting to question this industrial model of agriculture. We hear it all the time, and I'm even hearing it from a lot of legislators, but we're still all stuck in this narrative that says this is the only way that we can farm. What should we say to someone who still, or what would you say to someone who still holds that belief that there is not another way, and if we change anything, we'll destroy the economy? And why don't we start with Denise?
Well, as I was saying before, people, even though the system's not working for them, they're comfortable with where they are. They don't have to venture out to try, to try new ideas. And that it seems to me that we have to really engage the consumers and the public. There's not very many farmers. There never has been compared to the population of urban dwellers or country, county seats or, towns out in the rural areas. And the people have to rise up and say, we don't want dirty water anymore. And that this is the way that, we have to engage people, and that's going to force the change. When people are saying, I can't swim in this lake anymore. Larry and I will hardly go. We love to canoe and kayak, and we just will hardly go into the water because we know what's in the water. We are ruining a chance to bring people, to have people stay in Iowa. Today, a friend of mine said their kids are moving out. It's Iowa, with what the legislature's done this year and what we're doing to agriculture, there's no reason for them to stay. They're going to find, greener fields, where people are more, conscious. It seems like what we're trying to do in Iowa is shut people out, and which is really stupid, because the demographics of Iowa are that we're old people. And we need replacement. So we need people, we need, the diversity. We need, the consumers to demand that they want good food, and they want it local, and they want clean water that they can swim in, and they want, clean air that they can breathe. I mean, in a few days, we're going to be inundated with all the chemicals that are being the pre-emergence stuff. This is right now is a nice time in Iowa because it's before they're putting in hydroson, but you don't smell that so much. But pretty soon the pre-emergences are going on, and it's going to be just a smelly, yucky place. And it's just like, that doesn't attract people. And so, it's hard to convince the people who are in it already. I think we have to gain allies in other places.
Francis?
Well, I think if you want to see how you can do it different, you should join the Practical Farmers of Iowa listserv. It's farmers all across the state, lots of them, hundreds of them, that are doing all these innovative things. And it blows my mind sometimes to see the things they're doing with cover crops, mixtures of cover crops. And a lot of these are conventional farmers, not organic necessarily, but they're reducing their chemical usage. They're really farming regeneratively. So it can be done, no question about it. I would like to go to this, Jess, you talked about water quality being one of the things that you improve with good farming. And this is really interesting. We have a water quality initiative here in Iowa that we started in 2013, and the goal was for agriculture was to reduce nitrate leaching by 41%. Well, recent research by the University of Iowa shows we've actually increased our nitrate loss to the Mississippi and the Missouri rivers by about that much. So we're going backwards. This is a study done at Iowa State and USDA, comparing a conventional corn soybean cropping system with a typical organic kind of a system that has hay in it, alfalfa. And they found that the nitrate loss was reduced by half just from switching to this organic kind of regenerative, you might say, system. Suddenly it fixed the whole problem. The goal statewide is to reduce the nitrate leaching by 41%. Just switching to this regenerative farming organic system reduced it by half. And so these are like the beneficial side effects of a regenerative farming kind of system. And we're also building soil structure. We're making soil have more pore space so it can be more resilient in a flood system, reduces flooding. So all these beneficial side effects that we can have from farming correctly are out there just for us to do it. So I think this is pretty inspiring.
Yeah, I love being able to show real world examples to say this, we can farm another way. Dr. Eicher, do you want to close us out with that question?
Yes, I think if we're going to convince people that there is an alternative, and there is, we need to start by kind of putting farming into perspective. Because particularly in Iowa, you said we can't afford to do anything to agriculture. The whole state's about agriculture. It's the foundation for economy, foundation for rural communities. But the reality is that with the transformation of agriculture, industrial farming is no longer a major sector of the economy, and it's not nearly as important to communities as it used to be. Now, I looked up some statistics on it. About 1.3% of the total US population is farmers. And in rural areas, farmers only constitute about 10% of the population in the non-metropolitan areas. And if you look at the contribution to the GDP, the gross domestic product, farming only accounts for about 1% of the total GDP. And if you take the whole agri-food sector, it's only about 6% of the total GDP. It's not a major thing. Even in Iowa, farming only accounts for about 5% of the GDP and about 3% of the employment. In reality, what happens on farms these days has very little to do with the viability of rural communities, other than the fact that industrial agriculture is destroying them. It's not doing anything to save them. And I think the important thing is when we recognize that what kind of agriculture we've created, the fundamental purpose of supporting this with research, education, government programs, and everything was to provide food security. It was to make food more affordable to more people and to supposedly do it in a socially responsible way. It failed. The system that we have now failed to do any of the things that we supported it to do. And it's failing to do any of the things that we claim are essential, that we have to keep it functioning. We've never had a problem with agricultural productivity in this country. You give farmers a little bit of an economic incentive, they'll cover us up. We're not producing agricultural commodities for food today. We're producing them for export. We're burning up 40% of our corn crop in our cars. That's not about food security. We're subsidizing a failed system. We don't need industrial agriculture to feed the world. Contrary to popular opinion, 70 to 80% of the people, verified by numerous global studies, are not fed by industrial agriculture, but by small, what's about half of what we would call subsistence farms. We know how to double or triple the yields on those farms, proven by research, by agroecology and things of that nature. And in addition to that, any economic advantage that industrial agriculture has at the farming level over the alternative regenerative systems has to do with the scale. You simplify the process so they can go at a larger scale. And where that larger scale makes a lot of difference if you're going from a smaller farm to a much bigger operation, going from producing 1,000 hogs to 5,000, for example, and it makes a difference in the system. That larger scale is very small per unit of production, which means it has very little impact on retail food prices when you get to that level. And any disadvantage would be hardly noticed by consumers. We've upped consumer prices far more by ethanol and exports and things of that nature than we would by transitioning agriculture. And finally, we just got to come to the conclusion that what we're doing now is not sustainable, and we can either change it now or change it after it collapses.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really powerful. Thank you, all three of you. I'm going to switch over and have Pam read some of the questions from our audience tonight. So Pam, I know you've kind of been looking through them, so go ahead.
Thank you. I'm going to start out with one that was a comment, and it is, it would be great to include more vegetable farming into the local FFA chapters, and I might include 4-H. Do you have any comments?
Denise, you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because many of us, especially working in the farm to school sector, have tried this, and it's just really hard. There are some good instructors that will do this. They'll have greenhouses, they'll grow food and things, but it's like a hobby rather than what can really be done. And the other day for Ag Day, it happens every year, and that's everybody drives their big, huge tractors to school in celebration of Ag Day. And it just burns me up. And it's like a letter to the editor, but I've got to be careful because I don't, but it's, people are trying. It should be both in 4-H, you're right, and FFA, but it's the education that they get at Iowa State that leaves that out when these teachers go out into the school systems, and that they don't have that unless they were raised with it. There are some examples, but not many, unfortunately.
Education in the agriculture in the classroom has really become one of the major outreach things of the giant sort of propaganda public relations campaign that's being carried on by the promoters and defenders of industrial agriculture. They want to get to them when they're young and convince them that we absolutely have to have industrial agriculture and we're all going to starve without it. So we need to address that propaganda right up front.
Francis, do you want to add to that, or?
I think they covered it very well.
Okay. So Mel Conrad says, as a pilot, I see a lot of Iowa farmland and am dismayed at how much bare soil I see this time of year. What needs to be done to encourage cover crops?
Well, I would get back in again and say, I think that it's probably one of the easiest things to subsidize. And if we're going to have federal crop subsidies anyway, let's require cover crops, or let's require a water quality plan on the farm. Farmers can use whatever kind of technology they need to meet a goal for reducing water quality problems. So I think that cover crops are the big thing in Iowa that we could make a lot of progress on. We need to do it. Look back again at my 5 principles of regenerative agriculture. We're not meeting any of them.
Either John or Denise, do you want to add to that? No? Okay. I'm going to go on to the next question from Mike Tramontina. Tell us the model of a profitable, sustainable farm. How many acres? What crops or livestock?
Well, I'll just say, Francis probably could tell you what he has one. Denise probably could too, but every one of them is different. What people are looking for is kind of the industrial, one size fits all solution that you're used to with best management practices, the whole thing. That's part of the problem. That's not the solution. The individual farm has to be fit. I mean, the individual farming operation has to be fit to the land, the climate, topography, what can be produced there. As Wendell Berry puts it, you have to look and see what nature would have you do here and then try to figure out how to do it. So you fit the farming operation, but you also fit it to the community. Right now, the people that are successful have to do it outside of the industrial market. They've got to find someplace where somebody's willing to pay a premium price over and above what they would pay an industrial producer that produces something that kind of looks like and is labeled like it's about the same thing. And so you have to fit what your farming operation to the market that you have, your particular group of consumers and so on. So what looks like a profitable, sustainable farming operation is going to look different on every farm and every community and every area of the country. And that's one thing that really causes people all kinds of problems. They want a universal solution. They want an easy fix, and there isn't any. You have to empower people to go out here and learn to work with nature again. I've said that sustainable farming, profitable sustainable farming is one of the most intellectually, emotionally, and physically challenged things you could possibly do with your life, but probably one of the most rewarding. If I was 30 years old today, I'd become a farmer rather than a professor.
I think John really said it well, that he's pointing out it takes a lot of creativity to put all the pieces together, and there are a lot of ways to do it. And like in a conventional dairy farm where the cows are confined, you pretty much use a prescription. But in a grazing system, you're always learning new things about different species of grasses and clovers and how to manage them and how to work with the weather. I've had people come and tell me that I should start a franchise for my dairy all around the country. And I said, you don't have a clue. There's disaster lurking around every corner. You can't just take somebody off the street and put them in there and do it. It'd fail right away. It's a lifelong learning process.
Thank you. Denise, do you have anything to add?
No, I would say, I think there's people give an easy answer to why people aren't doing that. And it says there's people that don't want to farm anymore. It's too hard. But I think that we're not searching for those people. And in fact, they go through our farm a lot in internships and there's a lot of people who would like to farm out there who have grown up in a non-farm situation that we need to, open our farms up to and learn. And I always have said that with the farm to schools, when kids are learning to plant gardens at schools, that soil will capture them, and those will be our next farmers. And we're going to have to capitalize on that type of thing, and understand that give it a different value. The value of farming now is just a factory job. Farmers wouldn't like to hear that at all, but it's just a formula. They get in their tractors, they drive, they don't have to get out of their tractors and look at the soil. The most, creative, intellectual people that I've met have been the people who know what's going on in the soil and know what's going on in the environment around them. And so maybe we have to market farming in a different way, but also work on policy to make it happen.
Thank you.
Spot on.
Susie Petra is asking, what are some ways to rebuild soil? How long will various methods take?
Francis, you want to soil scientist? Got
Yeah,
a good answer for that.
For perspective, the traditional idea, research shows in soil science that you gain about a half a ton of soil per acre per year with our regular systems of farming, but we lose about 5 ton per acre per year in Iowa. So we're losing soil at 10 times the rate we're gaining it. Now with regenerative farming systems, Some farmers are doing incredible things, and the science has not caught up to them yet. They're really building soil quickly. I saw some research on a grazing system in Mississippi where they doubled their soil carbon in 10 years. And so they're building soil. We don't even know what the potential is for that. But we know that there's a tremendous potential to build carbon in the soils because we lost half of it or more around the world. We lost 50 to 70% from agriculture. So if we can put that back in again, we can put in a tremendous amount of carbon in the soil, because even now there's more soil carbon in the soil than there is in all of the atmosphere and the biosphere, all the plants and animals in the atmosphere together. So it's a tremendous potential, but it's going to take a change in farming, where we got the guy who's got the sign up that says, just let me farm. He's not going to do that. And so and it's not going to be easy. There are ways to do it, but it's not going to be a prescription. And I'm worried about the greenwashing Denise talked about, how somebody's going to have some no-till Roundup system and say, this is regenerative agriculture. We all need to do that, and all we need to get paid for it. So I kind of wandered away on that. But basically, back to those 5 principles to build the soil, you need something living on the soil all the time. That's a key thing. Have something alive on the soil all the time.
Yeah, I think one of the key things, and again, I'm talking about what I've read about regenerative agriculture, actually farming operations that have done it and things of that nature, is it really depends on how much the soil has been depleted, and then what kind of climate you're in, what kind of crops you can grow, and that sort of thing. Again, it's fitting the soil building. But an important part of it, the ones I've seen where they've really increased productivity were farming operations basically that were worn out. You get a quick response if the farm's already worn out. You start adding, and it'll say I start adding profitability right away because it was going broke to begin with. But so if you start with a farm that isn't totally worn out, you may not see a quicker response. But the thing is, it will take some time if we're going to make this transition. That's the reason I talked about we need to give farmers some insurance as they go through that transition, because it'll take some time. Once you've regenerated the productivity of the soil, then I think the indications are, at least from the farmers that have done it, is we can have an agriculture that may be even more productive than industrial agriculture is now, and certainly more productive than an industrial agriculture will be in 10 or 15 years. But farmers are going to need some support and some assurance that they can make a living as they go through that soil building regenerative process to restore the natural profitability to that natural ecosystem. But I think we can get there. Another thing is I just finished, I read a book, Joe Lewis, that did the research on the interaction and what's going on between plants that talk to wasps and that sort of thing. It's called Smart Wasps and Talking Plants, how the natural ecosystems can control the predators in the field and can control pests in the field. He says you build a sustainable regenerative system, and he's one of the leading scientists in the world on this. He says you build a strong natural regenerative sort of ecosystem on a farm, and it'll be more productive than anything that we're doing now, and it won't create all the unintended consequences. So the possibilities are there. It's just going to take time.
Denise?
I think both of, I think we can go on to the next question. I think they both answered it in very well.
Okay, thank you. So this question has 2 different people, kind of the same tone. The first part of it is, how can we as individuals help to change the system? And the second one I'm going to add to that is, if you were the Iowa governor and the other panelists were legislators, what would you enact? So we'll start with you, Denise.
Well, you know, Francis and I both tried to be the Secretary of Agriculture of the state. and so many times people say to me, and I'm sure Francis too, if only that had happened, but it wasn't meant to be. What can people do? I think it's really important that that our policymakers, our public servants, we really have to participate in making policy. We let other people make policy. And this is what I'm really trying to get across to a lot of people. We may not know exactly, but we know that organizations, you know, that like Iowa Farmers Union is doing an excellent job, and the National Farmers Union on everything but ethanol, I think, but RFS. But anyway, that's the point of contention. But to support those organizations that have a direct voice. Now, we have an opportunity now with a new administration that's really keyed on climate change and what we can do and how farmers can be a major role in climate mitigation. And we have Vilsack, still some of us are still wondering how that will work out with him in this lead position again. But I think that we can't sit back and think someone else is going to do it. We have to be a united voice to say, this is what we demand, this is what we want. And I've gone head to head with my state legislator, and he and I don't get along, but he keeps hearing from me, and he wants me to give up from hearing. He doesn't want to hear from me anymore. But it's just, he keeps telling me every email, we were elected, we won 93 out of the 97 counties, so we're in control, so get over it. And that's not the way a public servant should be responding. And it just, really makes me angry. And so he's going to get over it when he gets replaced, so we have to be actively involved in the political realm, because we've been complacent over the years, and people say, oh, politics, but we have to engage, because I feel that our democracy is in real danger if we don't. So I think that's where consumers can come in and work together with farmers.
Francis or John?
I'll just say, do what we can do in our place. I'll have more to say to that in my closing statement. I'll leave it at that. I've been talking a lot. So.
Francis?
Well, I would just add that we can buy our food choices. If we buy food produced by Denise, by local producers, we're making a big step. We're supporting what we want. If we go to the big box stores and buy the fancy looking milk carton that has a picture of a cow on pasture, and it has the it's a label from the store, that's not right. That's not true. You got to look deeper into what's going on, and you need to, if you buy from the big box stores, it's going to be industrial agriculture, unless there's something in there that is not that case. So that's a big thing. Another thing, following up on what Denise said, is that we need to start to see through some of these politicians. I mean, there's been this last week, I think it was the Environmental Defense Fund, which one was it, Denise, that pointed out that the Raccoon River is like the third most polluted river in the country or something. And Iowa's Secretary of Agriculture said that's propaganda. And then he tried to talk about all the good things they're doing. But yet the data show that our water quality is going backwards. And so you got to see through these politicians that are just hoodwinking us. A lot of them can say a whole lot of words and not say anything.
So we have time for one more question. And what I'd like to do is have you discuss the issue of increased water filtration that comes from healthier soils and the ability to mitigate flooding, especially in the era of climate change. And is this an issue that needs to be discussed more? And also, how do you enable farmers to get back in the field sooner after wet periods? Francis, I think this is up your alley, and also Denise's.
Well, I think one thing we need to recognize is with climate change is having resilience on the landscape. If we get huge rainfall events now, for example, the landscape around Iowa, 2/3 of Iowa's landscape is corn and soybeans. There's nothing there. There's no resilience. It's going to run off. And then when the soil gets saturated, it's all going to run off. I've got some photos that I don't have time to show, but now if we had cover crops on the landscape, it protected from that hard rain, and the cover crops would begin to use some of that water. And another key thing is that it starts to build soil structure, making more capacity for the soil to absorb water. It's like making a bigger sponge and a more absorbent sponge of the soil. With industrial agriculture, the soil tends to get compacted and not able, and the pore spaces are very small, and it can't hold much water. And as we use these regenerative farming practices, the soil begins to open up. bigger pore spaces. It'll take in more water and hold more water. So we make the sponge bigger so we have less flooding when the flooding comes. So resilience is the key thing. And it takes all those principles of regenerative agriculture to grow in that resilience.
And we have to stop tiling. We just have to not do so much tiling. Everything just draining Iowa quickly into the creeks and rivers has just caused enormous. My husband is a bridge builder and he operates a crane, and they're having to do so much work in re-establishing banks on creeks and rivers, and it's undermining our bridges, the pillars that our bridges stand on, and it's causing us actually a lot of money. And taxpayers need to understand that the type of farming that we're doing is costing us a lot of money, and we have to be better educators about that.
Thank you so much. Now, we didn't get to all of the questions, but we may be able to send some responses to some of those that are in there. But I want to give everyone just 3 minutes to kind of anything that you think we should know to kind of close us out, and final thoughts or something that you're just itching to make sure you get to say. And let's start with Denise.
I want to hear the other two. John's ready. I want to hear I started it off, so I'm going to give my time to John.
Go ahead, Dr. Ikerd.
So you want me to go next? I said I was kind of putting off what you can do, because I think that's where, I think that's a good question to end up with, is the final closing thoughts is, okay, what do we do? Sometimes what we have been talking about here tonight in some of the transformation of agriculture from industrial to regenerative, sustainable, seems impossible. You look at what's going on here, and you look at the amazing sort of economic power of these giant multinational corporations that basically control agriculture through contracts or ownership, and more of it, and more land ownership is going to big investment firms that aren't even going to be involved in anything other than telling somebody what to do on the land. And so they use that economic power that they've got not only to manipulate markets to force independent producers who are more efficient than they are out of business, which is done consistently with the CAFOs, but they use that economic power for political power to basically dictate the farm policies that happen and the food policies through the whole system. And they talk about the future of agriculture that they envision. It's basically drones guiding robots across the fields out here with no farmers left, and rural communities are turned into agricultural sacrifice zones that we can pollute and plunder all we want to as far as they're concerned. And if we don't have to worry about animals because we're going to create the meat and the milk and various other things in test tubes somewhere from something, I don't know. But that's the vision that the big money in agriculture is promoting across this country and all around the world. And then you look at where we are, with the hunger and malnutrition and pollution and all that, and the government, including the big agricultural universities, I worked for 4 of them over 30 years, continue to support this industrial agriculture model, and all of our farm programs continue to support it. These are supposed to be the objective observers of what's going on. I can't believe agricultural economists can't read the statistics of USDA. Basically, everything I've said here tonight can be backed up with USDA statistics here, that is happening. But we need to look back and recognize that the way we got from the family farm agriculture in which I grew up, it wasn't sustainable, but we certainly recognized our interconnection with the land and with each other within our communities, maybe. But we realized kind of what we had to do. That transition to industrial agriculture wasn't decreed. It was supported by government policies, but it happened one farmer, one consumer, one taxpayer at a time, either changing the way they farm, changing what they eat, changing what laws or policies they were at least willing to support over time. And when we talk about changing from this industrial global food system to the local sustainable food system, that's the way it's going to happen. It's going to happen one farmer, it's already happening, one farmer, one consumer, and then they become more, and it's going to become one taxpayer, one policy advocate, one policy at a time. That's the way it's going to change. And so we just need to be prepared that It changed to begin with. The change from family farms to industrial happened in 40 to 50 years, basically between the 60s and the 90s. Pretty much it was done. And I think we can change it faster than that. The good news is we're further along now in knowing how to replace industrial agriculture than we were in the early 70s when we replaced family farms with industrial agriculture. All we need to do is put the policies in place. So I believe that we each have a purpose in life. That's the conclusion I've come to in my old age. Maybe it's rationalization, but I think we're here for a purpose. I think there's something specific we're meant to do, not something to achieve, but sort of a path that we're to walk. And if we find that purpose and if we fulfill it, we will have lived the best life we possibly could have lived, and we will have done the greatest good for humanity, the food system, for farming. We will have done the greatest good that we possibly could have done. We all have a stake in the food system, either as farmers, as consumers, as taxpayers, as policy advocates, as ordinary citizens. We all have a stake. Part of our purpose relates to farming and food. If we will simply look for and find the courage to follow what we can do individually, there's no way of knowing that anybody's more important than anyone else, because it's all connected. Everything we do connects everything else. That's the way the whole system changes. And I think what we need to do is just do our part and trust that other people will do their part, and together we can bring about the change that we need.
I could not have said that better myself. That was so enlightening. Thank you so much. Francis, you want to go, and then Denise, we'll have you close out since you started us off.
Well, I'll just try to add something. That was brilliant, John, and I hope I don't detract. But if we, from my perspective, if we stand back and look at our industrial agriculture, it's not profitable for farmers on the long run. It's not working for the environment, not working for farmers. It's not working for the environment. It's not working for rural communities. So who's it working for? It's working for the corporations. And that's why it's not profitable for farmers. They're extracting the resources, as John said, from the rural communities. So if our agriculture is not working for farmers or the environment or for rural communities, then it's time to change. And we need to look at the policies that can integrate together and affect all three. So we need to make agriculture profitable for family farms while we're making it environmentally sound and while we're building something that can help rural communities.
Thank you. Denise?
Well, we need the political will. You know, it's hard to make changes. And it's really the question before, if you were governor and the panelists were legislators, what would you do? It's like, you know, what I would do is I'd start making laws that you have to do a balance. So I can't say that I'd start making laws, but I would decentralize the CAFOs. We would start breaking them down and giving opportunities to farmers to get into farming and make them, again, the mortgage burners like they were when I started farming, and that it's better pork. You know, the uniformity that they've done. I've been really shocked at how well we don't buy food we don't buy meat at the grocery store. We buy it from farmers, and there's not a uniformity to it. So nature isn't uniform. That we shouldn't have uniform sliced and diced vegetables and meat and all that. So there's a lot of education to do. And as a governor or as a leader, it would be that starting, working on the issues of how do we take back Iowa? This is kind of where I started. My mind is just always on that as I go throughout the day. It's like, how do we take back Iowa and make it a place where we can swim in the rivers, where we can swim in the lakes, where we can, don't have to be captured in our houses because the CAFO has made it impossible for us to go outside. I'm grateful every day that I don't have to deal with that. So we have to break down the system that we have now and replace it. And and recognize, I think part of this is also recognizing that we're on stolen ground. I'm on land that was taken care of by others before me. And and those people were displaced. Those people with our colonization, with our genocide, with all the things we used, it got me here to where I am. So I think in my own life, I have to make up for that and make Mother Earth a more viable and a more living being. I mean, a living entity. She is. I read a prayer the other day by the Iroquois, and it said we have to thank Mother Earth for letting us walk on her. And I think, well, that's pretty simple. Every day we're walking on Mother Earth, and we need to thank her for that. And I think that we need to go back to some of the principles of those who were here before us, recognize who was here before us, and recognize how we have participated in a system that displaced other people and communities and cultures, and how do we recapture that?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. One thing that stood out to me that I know was a lesson that I was taught growing up was leave something better than you found it. And I think that is really important to keep in mind as we're discussing these kind of issues. So in conclusion, I just really want to thank you, Denise and Francis and Dr. Ikerd, for joining us and sharing this incredible vision that you all have for a new agriculture system. We appreciate your time and your knowledge, and it's going to help us all be better activists and advocates as we work to build this new agriculture system. And thank you everyone who joined us tonight. Next time you hear Feed the World, this is the only way to farm, fence row to fence row farming, just know now that this is not true. We have a new vision and it's already spreading across the state. So we will post the link to our soil policy in the chat box again here in just a minute. So please take an opportunity to look through that, and then make sure you're opening up your Sierra Club emails to find out how you can stay involved in our soil work over the summer. And when we have another event in person or online, starting July 4th, we may be doing some in-person outdoor stuff. So we'll also send a follow-up email in the next couple of days with a link to this video of this discussion and to our soil policy. So thank you, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful evening. And
thank you, Jess. Thank you, everybody.
Yes, thank you. Bye-bye.
For those who are left, I did post the link to the full report in the chat. I think I saw, Jess, at the most we had 66 people